Democratic Congressman Ted Lieu. So what should the Democrats do about this?
Thank you, Chris, for your question. I think we just should be consistent. And I agree with what Senate Leader Mitch McConnell said during the Merrick Garland nomination. He stated that the American people should have a voice in the selection of the next Supreme Court justice. Then he held that open for nearly a year. We should just be consistent and make sure that this nomination is held open for less than 5 months.
So how do you go about that?
Happen.
Obviously, he had the way to do it. He was the leader. He was the majority leader. What do? Do you refuse the Republicans a quorum? Do you barricade the doors? Do you occupy the floor? What do you do? What are the Democrats supposed to do?
I would try everything, but also I believe in Abraham Lincoln's statement when he said that public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. And you can see with today's Pruitt resignation, that happened not because of any legal matter, but because of public outrage.
But there is no poll that suggests that people want this delayed. I don't think there's public outrage about a decision to replace a justice who's decided to step down. So, I mean, for example, should Chuck Schumer punish any Democrat who goes against this pick? Should he punish them with seniority, taking away committee spots? What should he do?
I can't speak for what Chuck Schumer would do or not do, but I do note that in my experience in politics, no one wins elections if they can't mobilize their own base. So whether you're a moderate or you're a progressive Democrat, to win, you still have to mobilize your own base. And if you are not responding to your base, your election chances diminish.
So I want to make sure that I understand you, though. If Democrats promise that they're going to fight on the nomination and they don't have success on that, and whoever one of these three conservatives that we believe is one of the finalists becomes the next Supreme Court justice, should people who, especially Democrats who may have voted for this person, be voted out? Should they be punished? Should Chuck Schumer then lose his position? It's not as though this is a surprise. It's not as though they didn't have time to come up with a strategy. Do you think that there is a clear strategy by the Democratic leadership?
Well, part of the issue is we don't know exactly who the pick is. Once that happens, there will be a vetting process, and it's up to individual senators to do what they want to do. But again, in elections, really, if you can't mobilize your own base, it makes it hard to win. And we also just have to be consistent. The Republicans held the nomination for nearly a year. I think we should do what the Republicans did and have Republicans hold it for at least past November, because the American people do deserve a voice in the selection of their next Supreme Court justice.
Do you have faith in your leadership, both on the House and the Senate side, going forward?
I do. And since Trump got inaugurated, Democrats across the nation have won 43 special elections, including 2 federal ones, one in Alabama, one in Western Pennsylvania. So I do have faith in our leadership, yes.
Well, there is also some disagreement about what to do about immigration, as you well know, and there are these calls to abolish ICE. There are others who believe that this is just a distraction, off message, that the message should be about what the public, frankly, has been moved by, and that is the emotion of seeing children ripped away from their parents. Was that a mistake? Are these calls a mistake? Did the Democrats need to have a more unified message?
I don't think those calls were a mistake. We've got a big tent party where we welcome people of different views. My own personal belief is we need to do 3 things. Secretary Nielsen of Homeland Security needs to resign. The new ICE director that was just installed needs to change the culture of ICE. And third, Congress needs to change the policies of ICE so they're not terrorizing communities. But if none of those 3 things happens, then we should replace ICE with an agency that is consistent with America's values.
So here you have yourself in a position where until at least November, there isn't a whole lot, at least in terms of legislation or power that the Democrats can do. Let me ask you about what you think about Scott Pruitt. Is there, it looks as though, at least for 200 days, the president can have someone in there who has the same views, will pursue the same agenda, if not the same kind of ethical lapses we saw. What's your take on what happened with Scott Pruitt, and does it change the equation at all?
Although Democrats are in the minority party, I think we should not underestimate the power of public opinion and the power of public outrage. And that's what we're seeing across America. The Trump administration has had to reverse several times on both policies as well as personnel because of public opinion. And then in terms of actual policies, we're going to have to wait and see what the new EPA interim director does. By all accounts, he does seem to be fairly conservative, and he was a lobbyist for the coal industry. And by the way, coal is not coming back no matter what anyone does.
Do you expect to see a lot of your fellow Democrats running against Scott Pruitt, running against the president on the whole drain the swamp pledge?
I think definitely corruption is a major aspect of November's midterms, but Democrats are also running on an economic message for a better deal, for better wages, better jobs, and a better future. And it's very clear when you look at their tax law that the Republicans passed, it is not helping ordinary middle-class families. It's basically helping the super rich and the top 1%, and the voters understand that, and they will vote accordingly this November.
So I want to make sure I'm hearing you right. You believe more in running on an economic message, less about running against Donald Trump?
Yes, I believe that would be good, but there are some districts where you can do both, where you would do one or another. The interesting thing about midterms is we're targeting over 100 different congressional districts, and the candidate in Southern California will not be talking about the same thing as a candidate in Kentucky, and that's okay because candidates are representing their own local district.
Congressman Ted Lieu, thank you.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Beat the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.